Flathead Valley, Montana. September 1895. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine resin and the coming frost. Below the jagged Mission Mountains, the valley floor was a patchwork of golden aspen and dark timber, dotted with the fresh scars of new homesteads. On one such plot, Torvald Brecke was building something that made no sense. His neighbors, men who had raised cabins from the plains of Nebraska to the forests of Oregon, would stop their wagons on the rutted track to watch. They'd watch Torvald and his young son, Lars, wrestling timbers that were far too long for any sensible house. They watched him set them at an angle that was downright offensive to the eye. "He's building a church steeple, not a cabin," Jedediah Ames remarked one afternoon, leaning on the fence post of his own sturdy, low-pitched home. Win Calder, owner of the valley's only lumber yard, and a man whose opinions were as seasoned as his timber, pulled his horse to a halt. He stared at the skeletal frame rising from the earth, two steep planes meeting at a ridiculous, sky-piercing peak. "It's more than foolish, Jedediah. It's a waste." He gestured with his chin. "That's a 70-degree pitch if it's an inch. He's using 20-foot rafters where a sensible man would use 12. That's nearly double the board feet for a roof that will catch twice the wind. The man's mad." The word spread through the valley, carried with sacks of flour and barrels of nails. The Norwegian, Brecke, was building his snow splitter, his timber tent, his fool's peak. The mockery was good-natured mostly. This was a land that tested ideas against rock and ice, not theory. Torvald's idea looked, to all experienced eyes, like one destined to fail spectacularly. What did this Norwegian stave church carpenter, a man who had spent his life working on the ancient dragon-headed churches of his homeland, understand about moisture, snow, and the brutal physics of a Montana winter that the seasoned frontiersmen of the Flathead Valley had missed? The answer to that question would not be found in argument or debate, but in the silent, unforgiving laboratory of the coming winter. Before we see how this strange triangle of a house defied a mountain snow siege, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We explore the forgotten wisdom of those who built a new world with old knowledge. I promise you, we'll learn not just the story of a strange house, but the fundamental reason why a dry wall is always more important than a thick one. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective design you've ever seen? Torvald Brecke was not a frontiersman. He was not a farmer, nor was he a trapper. He was a timmerman, a carpenter. From the misty hills surrounding Bergen, Norway, his hands, thick with callus and scarred by the slip of a chisel, knew the language of wood in a way few men did. He hadn't learned to build square, squat cabins from milled lumber. He had learned his trade as an apprentice, restoring the 1,000-year-old stavkirker, the stave churches of Norway. His world was one of vertical staves, of complex joinery that shed water without a single nail, of steep, tarred shingle roofs, pitched like mountain faces to shed the immense weight of wet, heavy Scandinavian snow. He understood that a building's greatest enemy was not the cold, but the water that cold commanded. He, his wife Solveig, and their 2 children, Lars and Astrid, had arrived in Montana 2 years prior, drawn by the promise of land and the letters from Solveig's cousin. They built their first home as they were instructed by their new neighbors, men of goodwill and deep experience in this new country. They laid a foundation of stone, raised walls of 10-inch pine logs, and chinked the gaps with mud and moss, and they built the roof the American way, a low, gentle pitch of 4 and 12, easy to walk on, economical with timber, and perfectly adequate for the rains of the Ohio Valley or the light snows of the prairie. Their first winter in that cabin was a lesson in misery. The snow came in November and did not leave until April. It piled on their low-pitched roof, heavy and wet. The modest heat from their cast-iron stove rising through the ceiling melted the bottom layer of the snowpack. This meltwater trickled down the shingles until it reached the cold, unheated eaves, where it froze solid. An ice dam began to form, a thick, glittering barricade along the edge of their roof. Behind this dam, a pool of standing water grew. It backed up under the shingles, freezing and thawing, finding every tiny crack, every nail hole, every seam in the roof boards. Soon, the dripping started. First in one corner of the cabin, then another. Solveig moved their bedding to the center of the single room. She placed buckets and pans on the floor, the constant, maddening plink, plink, plink becoming the rhythm of their winter. The chinking between the wall logs became saturated and turned to icy mush. The bottom logs of the walls, where snow drifted and melted against them, were perpetually soaked. The wood, sodden and heavy, began to rot, a dark stain of decay creeping up from the foundation. The cabin was never truly warm, never truly dry. They burned through their woodpile by February and had to spend brutal, windy days felling and splitting green lodgepole pine, which hissed and smoked, but gave little heat. For Torvald, a man whose ancestors had mastered the art of living in the cold for 1,000 years, this was not just a hardship, it was a professional humiliation. He had built a house that was failing, and he knew exactly why. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was the water. The conventional frontier cabin, a masterpiece of rapid, rugged construction, had a fatal flaw in high snow country. It treated the roof as a simple lid. In reality, it was an active thermal system, and the standard design managed it all wrong. The low pitch, typically between 3/12 and 4/12, meaning 3 or 4 inches of vertical rise for every 12 inches of horizontal run, was an artifact of climates with less snowfall. It was economical, requiring shorter rafters and less material. But in the Flathead Valley, where 4, 5, even 6 feet of snow could accumulate over a winter, that gentle slope became a liability. The physics were inescapable. A cubic foot of light, fluffy snow weighs about 7 pounds. A cubic foot of dense, wet, compacted snow can weigh over 20 pounds. A standard 20 by 30 foot cabin roof could easily be holding 15,000 to 20,000 pounds of snow by midwinter, the weight of 10 draft horses. This immense load caused rafters to sag and ridgepoles to groan. But the weight was only the most obvious danger. The real killer was heat transfer and moisture. A log cabin loses a tremendous amount of heat through its roof, often measured in thousands of BTUs per hour. This escaping heat warmed the roof deck, melting the snow from the bottom up. This is where the ice dam phenomenon, which had plagued the Brecka's first winter, became so destructive. The meltwater, unable to drain past the frozen eaves, wicked into the very structure of the home. Wood is an excellent insulator, but only when it's dry. A dry pine log has an R value of about 1.25 per inch. A 10-inch thick dry log wall would have an R value of roughly 12.5, but when wood becomes saturated with water, its insulating properties plummet. Water is a far better conductor of heat than wood, or the tiny air pockets trapped within its fibers. A waterlogged pine log's R value drops to near 1.0, barely better than solid ice. The walls of a cabin like the Suttons' next valley over, perpetually damp from snowmelt, weren't just cold to the touch, they were actively siphoning warmth out of the house. The family was essentially living inside a refrigerated box, burning cord after cord of wood, just to fight a losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics. The waterlogged sills and wall bases didn't just feel cold, they invited rot, fungus, and the slow structural death of the home. Torvald had seen it everywhere. The bottoms of the cabins in the valley were turning dark and soft. They were dying from the ground up. The following September, Torvald began his new house. He chose a spot on a slight rise, where the wind could help his design. He laid a foundation of heavy riverstone, broader than necessary, and placed thick, hand-hewn fir sills on top, meticulously leveling them. So far his methods were conventional. Then he began framing, and the mockery started. Instead of erecting 4 walls to be capped by a roof, Torvald built what was essentially 2 massive, leaning walls that would serve as the roof itself. His rafters were not 12-foot lengths of 2x6 pine from Calder's mill. They were 24-foot fir poles, 6 inches thick at the base, that he and Lars had felled themselves, limbed, and skidded to the site with a borrowed mule. Each one was a testament to immense labor. He laid them out on the ground, a series of enormous triangles. Using a chalk line and a Norwegian framing axe whose curved blade was unfamiliar to his neighbors, he cut a complex bird's mouth joint at the base of each rafter, designed to sit perfectly on the sill plates. At the peak, he didn't just cut a simple plumb line. He carved an interlocking joint, a variation of a mortise and tenon he had used on the ancient churches, that would lock the 2 rafters together into a single, immensely strong truss. Raising them was the hardest part. He, Solveig, and 12-year-old Lars strained with ropes and pry bars, slowly walking the first massive A-frame truss into its vertical position. It towered over them, a stark, skeletal finger pointing at the sky. They braced it, then began the back-breaking work of raising the next and the next, spacing them 2 feet apart. The structure that took shape was utterly alien to the Montana landscape. It was all roof. The sidewalls were only as high as the foundation, a mere 2 feet. The living space was entirely contained within the vast, steep-sided triangle. Win Calder rode out on the 3rd day of framing, his face a mask of professional concern. He dismounted and walked the perimeter of the foundation, squinting up at the radical pitch. "Brecka," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've been selling lumber in this territory for 15 years. I've seen 100 cabins go up. This," he gestured, "this is a mistake." Torvald paused, his axe held loosely in one hand. He nodded for Calder to continue. "Your pitch is 70 degrees. You're using 24-foot timbers for a house that's only 20 feet wide. You could have roofed this place with half the lumber. I'm carrying your account on credit, Torvald, and I can't in good conscience extend it for this kind of waste. You'll have this thing framed and no money left for sheathing or floorboards." Torvald looked from Calder's concerned face to the mountain of long, clean timbers yet to be raised. He then looked at the dark, rotting sills of his old cabin, which he was using as a temporary shed. He said only one thing: "It is the roof I need." Calder shook his head, a mix of frustration and pity in his eyes. "The first heavy wind will peel it open like a tin can. Suit yourself, Brecka, but the credit stops today." He mounted his horse and rode off without a backward glance. The work continued. Solveig, who had trusted her husband's vision implicitly, felt a seed of doubt. "It looks so strange, Torvald," she said one evening, rubbing her sore arms, "like a tent made of wood. Mrs. Ames asked if we were planning to house giants." Torvald simply smiled. "A rare and fleeting thing. Let them talk. This house is not for looking at. It is for living in." He framed in the front and back gables, cutting openings for a door and 2 small windows. He sheathed the entire massive roof surface with 1x10 pine boards laid tight. Over this, he layered tar paper, and then, finally, cedar shingles. Inside, the space was cathedral-like. At the very peak, 20 feet above the floor, was a triangular space he left open to the small attic he'd framed at either end. This wasn't wasted space. It was a critical part of the design. A dead air pocket, an insulating buffer between the living space and the coldest point of the structure. He was building a house that worked with the winter, not against it. To understand the genius of Torvald Brecka's design, you have to understand the thermal dynamics of snow and water. His neighbors saw wasted timber. He saw a sophisticated machine for moisture management. The entire structure was built around one single powerful principle: keep the walls dry at all costs. Let's break down the physics. The enemy, as Torvald knew from his first miserable winter, was the ice dam and the pooled water it created. An ice dam is a product of a thermal imbalance. A poorly insulated attic or roof allows heat from the house, let's say 3,000 BTUs per hour, to escape and warm the underside of the roof deck to just above freezing, say 33 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the air outside is 10 degrees Fahrenheit. This heat conducts through the wood sheathing and shingles, melting the bottom layer of the snowpack that rests upon it. On a conventional 4/12 pitch roof, this meltwater is a slow-moving film. It travels down the roof plane until it reaches the eaves, the part of the roof that extends beyond the walls of the house. Here there is no heat from the house below. The eaves are at the same ambient temperature as the outside air, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. As the meltwater hits this freezing zone, it turns back into ice. Over hours and days, this process builds a solid ridge of ice, an ice dam. Once the dam is formed, the meltwater coming from higher up the roof has nowhere to go. It pools, creating a small reservoir. This standing water, often inches deep, is relentless. It works its way under shingle laps, around flashing, and through nail holes, seeping into the wooden structure of the house. This is where the catastrophic failure of insulation occurs. Dry wood contains millions of tiny trapped air pockets, which is what gives it its insulating R value. Water is a much better conductor of heat than air. When those pockets fill with water, the wood's ability to resist heat flow is decimated. A saturated 10-inch log wall, which should have an R value of 12.5, now has an R value of less than 2. The wall becomes a thermal sieve, bleeding precious heat into the frozen outdoors. The family burns more wood, more heat rises, melting more snow, feeding the cycle of water intrusion and heat loss. Torvald's 70-degree A-frame was a direct assault on this entire process. Its primary function was to deny water the one thing it needed: time. The angle of his roof was steeper than the angle of repose for snow, which is the steepest angle at which a sloping surface can hold loose material. Snow simply could not accumulate. As it fell, it would build up for a few inches, but its own weight would quickly overcome the friction holding it to the shingles, and it would slide off in a soft, harmless cascade. There was no massive snow load. There was no bottom layer to be melted by escaping house heat. There were no eaves to create a cold zone for ice dams to form. The walls were the roof, and they were designed to shed snow as effortlessly as a duck's back sheds water. By preventing the snow from lingering, Torvald prevented it from melting and saturating the structure. His walls would remain dry all winter long, and because they were dry, they would retain their full, natural insulating value. The small triangular dead air space he left at the peak acted as a final buffer, ensuring that any heat rising to the very top of the house would dissipate in that attic space rather than conduct directly through the ridgepole. It was a simple, elegant solution born from centuries of observation. That winter arrived with a fury that would become legend in the valley. It began not with gentle dustings, but with a siege. On the 3rd of December, the sky turned a flat, ominous gray, and the snow began. It did not stop for 19 days. A relentless, silent deluge of white buried the Flathead Valley. The wind sculpted it into massive drifts, erasing fences, roads, and the very shape of the land. By the time the sun finally broke through on December 22nd, more than 6 feet of snow had fallen on the level. For most settlers, it was a repeat of the misery of the year before, only magnified. At the Albright Homestead, a mile down the valley from Torvald, the strain was immense. Their low-pitched roof, groaning under an estimated 12 tons of snow, sagged visibly in the middle. The dripping was no longer a nuisance. It was a flood. Every pot and pan was full, the dirt floor was a muddy bog, and a permanent damp chill clung to the air. They burned through a cord of wood a week, the Franklin stove glowing red hot, yet the children, Martha and Samuel, still slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. The very walls seemed to radiate a deep, penetrating cold. Inside the Brecca A-frame, the world was different. The first few days of the storm, young Astrid was frightened by the sound. A low, intermittent shoosh, followed by a soft thump. It was the sound of success. It was the sound of snow sliding harmlessly off the steep roof planes and falling to the ground 2 feet away from the foundation walls. Inside there were no drips. The air was dry and warm. The stove, a small Norwegian model Torvald had brought with him, consumed wood at a placid, steady rate, less than half of what the Albrights were burning. The domestic scene was one of impossible normalcy. Solveig, finding the interior so evenly heated, was able to do something unheard of in a Montana cabin in December. She could prove bread dough. She set the wooden bowl on a stool near the wall, the very wall that in any other cabin would be the coldest, dampest surface in the room. In their A-frame, the wall was just a wall, dry to the touch, and holding the ambient warmth of the room. The scent of yeast and baking bread filled the small home, a smell of life and comfort amidst the white siege outside. Lars and Astrid played on the dry floorboards with carved wooden animals, their jackets and hats hung on pegs, forgotten. Torvald sat at his small table, mending a harness, the picture of a man at peace in his own home. He had not built a shelter, he had built a sanctuary. In mid-January, after the 19-day siege had passed and was followed by a spell of bitter, clear cold, Win Calder began making his rounds. It was partly business, checking on the families who owed him money, and partly a duty of care. He traveled on wide hickory snowshoes, the landscape transformed into a vast, rolling desert of white. He was worried. He'd heard that the Albrights' roof beam had cracked, and that the Suttons had moved in with their cousins after their roof had begun to collapse. As he neared the Brecca place, his worry sharpened into a specific, grim expectation. That ridiculous, steep-roofed contraption, with its absurdly long, unsupported rafters, must surely have been crushed inward by the snow or shattered by the wind. He crested the small rise and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The sight was surreal. The entire valley was a uniform, undulating sea of white. Every cabin was a low, sagging mound, roofs buried so deep they were almost indistinguishable from the surrounding drifts. But there, in the middle of it all, was Torvald Brecca's A-frame. It stood sharp and dark against the snow, a perfect, clean triangle. Its roof planes were nearly bare, scoured clean by wind and its own steepness. A small cap of white clung to the very peak, but the vast majority of the structure was exposed, dark cedar against the blinding white. There were no enormous drifts piled against its walls. The sliding snow had landed a few feet out from the foundation, leaving a clear, protected space around the base of the house. Calder approached cautiously, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. It looked effortless. While every other structure in the valley was being crushed, this one seemed to have shrugged the storm off completely. He got closer, running a critical eye over the construction. He expected to see the walls caked in ice from refrozen meltwater. He reached out a bare hand, his palm calloused from handling lumber. He expected to feel the familiar biting cold of an ice-sheathed log, or at the very least the damp chill of frozen, saturated wood. He touched the cedar shingles on the steep wall. He felt nothing. Just dry, cold wood, not damp, not frozen, dry. Stunned, he trudged to the base of the wall, his snowshoes sinking into the powder. He looked down at the massive fir sill resting on the stone foundation. It was completely clear of snow and ice. He could see the grain of the wood. It was as dry as the day it was laid. He finally knocked on the heavy plank door. Torvald opened it. A wave of simple, dry warmth washed over Calder's face, carrying the faint scent of coffee and wood smoke. It wasn't the scorching, humid heat of an overworked stove, but a deep, stable warmth that filled the space. Calder, his face chapped by the wind and cold, was momentarily speechless. He saw Solveig knitting in a chair, the children playing on the floor, no buckets, no damp stains on the walls, just a home. "Brecca," Calder stammered, his voice hoarse. "The snow, your roof, how?" Torvald didn't offer a lengthy explanation. He simply stepped back and gestured inside, a quiet invitation to witness the result. Calder stared at the clean, dry interior, at the massive, soaring timbers that held the impossible roof aloft. His gaze drifted back outside, to the stark, dark plains that had shed the weight of a winter that was breaking the backs of lesser homes. His entire understanding of sound construction, of what was sensible and what was foolish, reconfigured itself in that instant. He looked at Torvald Brecca, then back at the clean, sheer roof line. "You didn't build a roof," Calder said, his voice full of a new, profound respect. "You built a mountain that sheds its own weather." The story of the house that shed the winter spread as the snows began to melt in March and April. The real proof was not in the dramatic survival of the storm, but in the silent evidence left behind. As the snow receded from the walls of the valley's cabins, it revealed dark, ugly water stains, a clear line marking how high the damp and rot had crept. On Calder's own storehouse, the water line was 2 feet up the siding. On the Albright place, it was nearly 3. This was the mark of a winter spent fighting a losing battle with moisture. One Sunday, Calder asked Torvald if he could bring a few men over. They walked around the A-frame, and Calder pointed to the base. There was no stain. The fir sill logs were clean, sound, and dry. The evidence was irrefutable. Torvald's design hadn't just survived. It had conquered the core problem of winter construction. That summer, the proof of Win Calder's conversion was written not in a newspaper, but in his lumber ledger. He began stocking 24 and 26-foot lengths of fir and larch, timbers previously considered specialty items. He used Torvald's own discarded scraps to create a template for the precise 70-degree bird's mouth cut, and he hung it on a peg in his mill office. When new settlers came in looking for building plans, Calder would take them to see the Brecca house. He called the design the Brecca Pitch. By the fall of 1897, 4 new homesteads in the Flathead Valley and 2 over in the neighboring Swan River Valley were built with steep A-frame roofs. The quiet Norwegian's idea was becoming the new vernacular of the mountains. Torvald Brecca, the immigrant carpenter, had no formal training in physics or engineering. Yet with knowledge passed down through generations of his trade, he had intuitively grasped principles that modern building science would later formalize. His design was, in essence, a perfect, passive, cold roof system. By keeping the snow load off the structure, he prevented the heat of the house from melting it and creating the water intrusion that plagued his neighbors. He had built a home whose primary feature was a massive, well-drained, water-shedding surface. Modern architecture in places like the Alps or the Rockies still employs these very same principles, using engineered trusses, vapor barriers, and advanced membrane systems to achieve the same result that Torvald achieved with an axe, a mule, and an ancient understanding of wood and snow. There is a lesson in the quiet carpenter's strange-looking house that transcends architecture. It is a lesson in value. The frontiersman who mocked Torvald saw the world through a lens of immediate economy. They counted the board feet, the cost of the nails, the days of labor. By their math, Torvald's roof was a foolish extravagance. They saw only the initial price. Torvald, with the bitter memory of a damp, miserable winter fresh in his mind, was using a different calculus. He was not just buying timber, he was buying back the hours he would not have to spend shoveling his roof. He was buying back the cords of wood he would not have to chop. He was buying back the doctor's bills for his children's winter coughs. He was buying his family a winter of peace instead of a winter of work. The roof that sheds work is worth twice the timber it cost. The Flathead Valley, a place that rewards results, not theories, learned that the most expensive structure isn't the one that costs the most to build, but the one that costs the most to live in. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. Every story holds a lesson, and we're dedicated to uncovering them. What other old-world techniques do you think deserve a modern look? Let us know in the comments below. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative clarity. However, the building techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.